Welcome, and thank you for spending your lunchtime with us today. We're happy to start the 2021 Diversity and Inclusion Workshop Series back up with today's session on cultivating a diverse workforce. As always, the KC Chamber is grateful for the support of our amazing sponsors. Our workshop series presenting sponsor is Commerce Bank. Our presenting diversity sponsors are Community America Credit Union, Evergy, and Hallmark. Today's workshop is even more special because it's the first in a new partnership with the Blue Springs Chamber of Commerce. We're so glad they're here with us today. We do this work in this space and put these together in the hopes that businesses and organizations focus on diversity and inclusion across our metro, leading to a stronger KC for all. When the Blue Springs Chamber reached out to us, we knew having another great chamber reaching even more businesses in greater Kansas City would be a win for everyone. We hope this partnership grows to include even more chambers of commerce to promote events like this one and help foster true diversity and inclusion across our region. So now it's my pleasure to welcome the president of the Blue Springs Chamber of Commerce, Laura Vermillion. Laura?
Thank you, Joe. I'm very appreciative that you are open to the idea of offering your diversity and inclusion workshop series to members of other local chambers so that we could make this happen today. And we do have many of our community and business leaders participating in the program today. Your chamber has been doing such important work in this area, and we're very excited for this partnership. Because we know we don't function in an island in the suburbs of Kansas City, and for our communities to be successful, it's important for all of us to work together. Collectively, our community and business leaders have the opportunity to create real and meaningful change. And as we work toward that change, the first step is to listen and to gather information. And that's what this series is all about. So if we can join your efforts and be part of the momentum that you've already created, we're making a better Kansas City for all of us. And that's what we want. We want to be part of creating a more open environment where everyone feels welcome, included, and that they can be the most successful. So thank you again for allowing us to participate.
That's awesome, Laura. And thank you very much for being part of today. Couldn't agree with you more. And once again, thank you to all of our sponsors. And I'd like particularly to welcome one of those sponsors, Tarina Terry, Vice President of Commerce Bank. Tarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, and welcome to another session of the KC Chamber's Diversity and Inclusion Workshop Series. We are so glad to see you here. I'm Tarina Terry, Vice President and Treasury Implementation and Delivery Manager for Commerce Bank. This month, we are taking a closer look at how to cultivate a diverse workforce and a corporate culture that supports one. Perhaps never has this topic been more timely and more necessary than it is right now. As divisions threaten to fracture our country and communities, we have an opportunity, you might even say a duty, to lead by example, by creating workplaces where all races, individuals with a disability, creeds, and points of view are represented. We can help dismantle stereotypes and model how to treat everyone without exception, with the dignity and respect they deserve. At Commerce Bank, a diverse workforce is also good for business. The customers and communities we serve are diverse, and our workforce should reflect them. We believe our bank is made stronger when people representing diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences work together. Everyone benefits when our customers and team members feel valued, listened to, and appreciated. Of course, a diverse workforce does not spring up overnight. Like a good vegetable garden, it must be cultivated. That requires intentional planning, fertile soil, and daily care. Recruiting and retaining diverse talent is no different. At Commerce Bank, it begins with how we attract, recruit, and engage with team members. It continues with how we connect them to the bank and each other through our network of employee resource groups, mentoring, and other programs. Our efforts also extend to the larger community, where we participate in diversity initiatives and minority-focused chambers of commerce, including our participation in this DEI workshop series. Much work remains, but the harvest we all reap will be worth it. And now to introduce today's speaker, Nicole Jacobs-Silvey, founder and president of Connection Coach KC. Nicole has interesting data to share on leaders of color. She also has insights on how to create a pipeline of diverse candidates and build a culture of belonging. Nicole, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tarina. What a welcome that you provided for me. And I'm so glad to be here today as a part of this new series with the Chamber in collaboration with the local chambers and our honored partners. Thank you so much today. And with that, I would like to start the presentation with talking about cultivating a diverse workforce. As Tarina and the other partners so eloquently, we are looking to create a new normal. We know that what's gotten us here is not going to get us there. And while we feel like we have made progress over the last several decades, we know that there is much work to do. And it's together that we will get that work done. So today in our presentation, I'm going to go through several things. Again, I'm Nicole Jacobs-Silvey with Connection Coach KC, and I'm going to be talking about several aspects of how to diversify your workforce intentionally by taking intention to action. As a member of the Chamber, an honored member of the Chamber, I've been engaging in these conversations since last summer, and it's exciting to see where we've gone with these conversations. I like to, when speaking about diversity, equity, inclusion, take a three-prong approach, and you've seen that happen here at the Chamber: the listen, learn, and lead approach. Last summer, you may recall, the Chamber led some listening sessions. I think there were 3 to 4 parts where we engaged people from the African American community in explaining their experiences and sharing dialogue about their lived experiences. That was the catalyst for so much more of the work that we see today. And we're going into learning deeper about how did we get here, and even more importantly, how have we remained here? And then utilizing that information to lead in any space that you are in. So our time together today is brief. And so with that, I wanted to put some context around our conversation today. We'll be speaking a bit about the history, about our community, and the tips and tools that you can take to create action within your workplace. In that context, we know that diversity is a broad scope, and many of the groups that we represent, we've talked about those that are differently abled, those of different sexual orientation, religion, and creed, as well as gender diversity. We today are going to focus primarily on the African American experience and the history that has been systemic in oppression. So I'm going to start with a poll question. I would like you to consider, is the workforce more diverse today than it was 50 years ago? And you should see a question pop up. If you can answer that, thank you, Sydney. We'll populate that question. Okay, so we see with the poll results here, overwhelmingly, those of you who contributed said yes, that today the workforce is much more diverse than it was 50 years ago. Well, the research may surprise you a bit. You aren't wrong. And those of you who said no, you're both, it's kind of a two-part fold question. Yes, there are more people of color in the workforce today, but in terms of the workforce looking more diverse, it actually has not changed much in the last 2 to 3 decades. What we've seen is, while there have been more people who have entered the workforce, still largely those individuals of color are in lower level positions rather than in the hierarchy or the leadership of the organizations. So while organizations are more diverse, they still do not have the leadership team representation of diversity. So how did we get here? I mentioned that. The goal, you see the picture on the left, diverse candidates, jumping, joyful. There's many stock photos that we've seen over time that demonstrate what we want diversity to look like. We have the picture, the image, but the reality still remains that white men are predominantly the ones in leadership and those who are making key decisions at the table in terms of hiring, recruitment, and retention, setting the tone for what our workforce looks like. So the history, what we must do before we get into deeper conversation, we must first acknowledge the past so that we can change for the future. And today we're going to share a brief history about racial segregation within our country and how that still persists today and plays out in our everyday environments. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch that video, a powerful history of segregation in our country and how we got here, how it plays out in our everyday workplace. And what I love so much about the video is it shows it with precise precision how the intersection of power and privilege meet. When we talked about the hierarchy within the places in which Black people are employed, they noticed that the lower entry point positions were largely filled by people of color, while the leadership positions, those decision-making key positions, were by white individuals. That plays out in all areas except in those institutions that were mostly led by people of color. That's a strong distinction that we need to note in terms of who is at the table and who has that decision-making power. As we look at how this happened, the Jim Crow laws, segregation by law, this was not by accident. This was by design and the very definition of systemic oppression. As we know, the Jim Crow laws, which spanned nearly 100 years from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, were local and state statutes that made racial segregation legal. The laws were intended to marginalize Black people by denying access not only to employment opportunities, but the right to vote, housing, and education, things that we see persist today in 2021. Policies may be gone, but the practices remain. So we know that Jim Crow laws were abolished and determined as discriminatory, but while generations of individuals lived out those practices, they persisted in spite of the policy changes. So when did that actually occur? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark labor law. It is the specific law that spoke to outlawing discrimination based on all the areas of diversity that we've mentioned: race, color, religion, sex, national orientation, and later sexual orientation and gender identity. So what I want you to do at this time in thinking about where we are today in terms of our executive leaders and maybe looking at your own organization or businesses that you are familiar with, I'd like you to take a moment and make a list of 3 executive leaders, just the first 3 that come to mind. And as you think of that group, that 3 leaders that you've selected, I want you to take a look at this wheel of privilege that Sylvia Duckworth has created. And many of you may have seen versions of this. What it does is show the wheel of power and privilege and those from marginalized communities. You can even envision this circle or this wheel as a pyramid, with power at the center being the very point, and the outer circle of most marginalized individuals as being the base of a pyramid. What this document shows is how privilege and power play out based on the identities that we identify with. So as you notice in the center, power, by no accident, is associated with white, being a citizen, cisgender and also male, English speaking, wealthy, owns property, slim, robust in terms of mental health, neurotypical, heterosexual, and able-bodied, in addition to being college educated. The closer you are to, and our workforce continues to be centered in what we call whiteness, which is what the center of this wheel represents. The closer one is to identifying with each of those areas that I just listed, the more likely they are to be successful, not only in traditional workplaces, but in education, in social settings. That is what often people refer to as the right fit. You'll see as the circles go out, marginalized communities. So the farther one gets away from the center, the more that they will be marginalized and receive different opportunities, or I should say obstacles, based on their differences. So you see in the marginalized continuum, such things as skin color, some form of disability, different sexual orientation, being farther away from rich, and then the circles go out. So depending on where you line up on this wheel often determines your ability to access opportunities in terms of success, privilege, and promotion within the workplace. So for example, if you look at the center, someone can be a Black woman such as myself, but in being cisgender and being English speaking, maybe of a different socioeconomic, can determine where you move in fluidity within this power wheel. And I want you to take a moment and think about those 3 individuals that you selected. And were they closest to the power wheel in the center, or were they part of the marginalized outside? What we mostly see, again, is that those individuals that come to mind are often in the center because they have their basic access to privilege and to progress. Bias. Black candidates with Black sounding names are 50% less likely to receive follow-up calls from resume review process than their white peers. And many of you may have seen this. So what do I mean by Black sounding names? If a name is sounding as people perceive as a white traditional name or a Eurocentric name, that individual with the exact same resume, so in blind resume reviews, will receive a call more likely than someone who has a Black sounding name, with the idea that when we hear whiteness, we hear intelligence, that bias persists in every environment, especially when employing new candidates, especially for leadership positions. So what does that mean? What does that look like? How does that play out? One of the quotes that I heard that I thought was so powerful and spoke to this situation so well was, Blacks are hired based on their potential, whites are hired based on their potential, while Black people are hired based on accomplishments. It has been no accident that people, especially in the Black community and Latinx as well, have said that they must create resumes that are so robust that they must be credentialed, degreed beyond what their white counterparts are just to be considered for a position. When one is seeking a position and is hired, we often say, why is it that we do not retain Black specifically talent? And in talking to numerous Black professionals across Kansas City as well as nationally, the research shows that often Black professionals feel as if they are two people. There's the authentic self versus assimilation, or what is deemed appropriate within the workplace culture. So with the document, the picture on the left, which talks about cultural identity, that's a willingness or the ability to freely express who one is as their natural self. And then on the right, acting in ways counter to one's authentic self in order to be accepted, believing that there is an unspoken code of which you are being judged and evaluated that's based on how you present, often different than one's culture. This type of authentic self versus assimilation has caused people of color to feel exhausted, depression, anxiety, with this additional burden on one's back of having to assimilate and work and to navigate in a setting. It's very challenging to be able to focus on the work at hand and to use the strategies and competencies and skill sets that they have within the workplace. Limiting beliefs are what keep us here. So often, the biases that we have and that we display in leadership come from these myths, these limiting beliefs that not only are our mindset, but also dictate our actions. So some of those statements are things such as, you need to decrease qualifications to increase diversity. This is a belief that we cannot find candidates that are also people of color that can meet the expectations of a role or an opportunity. And we've seen this time and time again. Research has played out to say that is not true at all, that is a myth, and that the qualifications of people of color match their white counterparts, but the opportunities do not. It has been said that opportunities are not evenly distributed across communities, but talent is. Also, there is a level playing field. The belief that we have all been born into the same opportunities and we have the same access has been disproven not only by research, but as you saw in that video. The video specifically spoke to the lack of opportunities that Black people had, be it because of segregation, or be it because of lack of education opportunities, all the things that played out in that pre-Jim Crow era. And if you work hard, you get promoted. That meritocracy is the way in which people have received their leadership positions, that they did that only by their hard work, that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you will get those positions that you so seek and that there'd be greater representation. The thing is, when we say pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, I dare say there's some people who have yet to have boots. The opportunities to access, then pull oneself up, it negates the fact that there are key obstacles, a part of systemic oppression that, as we saw in the video, were by design. They were instrumental and created specifically to hold Black people back. And while some of those pieces have been removed, the practices persist in lieu of the policies. A common statement is, but we have a Black president, or naming other Black successful people such as Oprah, Tyler Perry, or whomever it may be. The fact that there are individuals who have been able to be successful in spite of the obstacles and challenges that come with systemic oppression just shows the resilience and the perseverance of individuals, and not that racism does not exist. So what does the data say? We know that we have work to do. We know we have far to go, but sometimes it's the numbers that make it ever so clear. When we're looking at the Fortune 500 companies, still only 4 Black CEOs persist within that space, and all 4 of those happen to be male. Then, in looking at Blacks in executive level positions in America, still only 3.2% of Blacks occupy those positions, even at the same time that the rates of Blacks graduating from college has risen, and Black women are receiving their bachelor's degrees at greater numbers proportionately than any other demographic group. Still, in spite of that, we are seeing that Black individuals, especially professionals, still persist in middle to lower end positions. So why does that happen? The biggest recruitment tool, when we talk about recruitment, so often is this guiding question, the who do you know? And as we saw in the video, it was so key that 75% of white individuals still have friends that are only white. We say, who do you know? And we send it out to our network, those people that are most trusted, those that we believe in, and that's who we share the word of mouth opportunities. I think many of you, as you reflect on your circumstance and how you got to your position, it probably was through networking. Opportunities you heard about, it might have been someone tapping you on the shoulder and recruiting you for the position. When you are in a position of not knowing others or others not knowing you, the challenges are monumental in terms of accessing positions that can lead to leadership opportunities, be it in the boardroom or in your community. I'd like to take a moment to do another poll question. And for this poll question, what is the biggest contributing factor to workplace retention? And there's 3 choices there. Is it leadership, your supervisor, culture, or salary? Largely people said culture. So culture went out with 66%, and then leadership at 35%, with salary being the lowest. And you are right. There's no fooling the folks who are watching today. Culture, as we know, so often we talk about culture eating strategy for lunch. Well, if that's the expression, I like to say culture eats talent for breakfast. When people talk about where they're going to persist in an environment, belonging is considered one of the greatest factors in retention and overall job satisfaction. We know that we are spending more time at our jobs, and especially in light of COVID, where our work days can blend in with our personal time, than ever before. And because of that, people want to be in a space where they feel valued, respected, trusted, and celebrated. And if they are not, we're in a mobile community that people will quickly switch to or look for other opportunities where they will get that sense of belonging. In years prior, salary, especially a pension, had been the number one factor that people sought in order to find workplace satisfaction. It was, what could the bottom line financially be? As we work more and more and we see the spaces that we embody, we know that belonging is key. So what does that look like? Well, here are some of the reasons of what can lead to people exiting if there's a poor culture or work environment. And I titled this, Why Did He Leave? But it could be, why did she leave or they leave? The exodus and the infamous letter of resignation. You may relate to this as you're listening and watching this presentation. You did a search for an executive leader. You found a talented candidate that was a person of color, may have been a Black individual. It felt like a match. The right fit terms were thrown around. and they were invited to join your team only to leave within 2 or 3 years. Someone who within the interview time had said that they intended to stay longer, someone that you originally saw as having advancement opportunities, but they did not retain in their space. So here are some of the key reasons, because that's a common tale, and one that not only hurts the organization and the business with all the onboarding and time that's spent, but also the drain of talent that happens in our community. So the number one reason that this often happens is not acknowledging the unique experiences of BIPOC community, with BIPOC being the Black, Indigenous, people of color community. It's no accident that people of color have unique stories and experiences, and often what we are taught is there are two things we're taught, right? We don't talk about religion or politics, but there's actually this hidden third. It's so hidden we don't even mention it. The thing we don't talk about is race, and that we have different experiences. This head in sand approach that we will ignore what is happening and state things like everyone is treated equally without seeing the specific situations or listening to the specific stories of the employees that are part of your team is the biggest way for someone to feel alienated, disenfranchised, and disillusioned. And that leads to the exit. Second, few opportunities to engage with senior leaders. When we think about those who are being tracked and being encouraged to be promoted, we see that they are engaging with senior leaders in really intentional and specific ways. It may be mentoring, it may be one-on-one engagements, it may be social settings, but those key interactions happen to allow people to get promoted. And we know that people of color are disproportionately unable to have access to those senior leadership members as the same way. Third, the exclusionary and hostile work environment. We've talked about microaggressions in our community, those subtle, not so subtle, racist and discriminatory comments or experiences that people of color experience within the workplace, or out and out hostility. Some of the very things that people of color are recruited for to show up in a space are the things that they are later penalized for. For example, tone policing. When someone is a candidate, often their vision, their willingness to speak up, their extrovertedness, their ability to take chances and to navigate risk is celebrated. It's a part of what's seen as a key aspect of their position. Yet, if they demonstrate those specific things in areas that push up against the status quo, they often are made to feel exclusionary, and the work environment can become hostile. Fourth, avoidance of discussing race in the workplace. I spoke about this a bit, and what I mean by this is that the acknowledging that race is an issue without speaking any words. So there's this tension, people know that things exist, it's been brought to the surface, but not only is there no discussion about and a plan of action for success, but there is an avoidance and a denial. And it leads to exodus of many of our talented staff. So what do we do now? What do we do now that you have this information? Because knowing is not enough. We know we must take action. So there's been intention to action in our city for so long. We've had intention, we've talked about this. How can we make change within our space? So recruitment, these are some key steps that have been indicated across in universities. Both Stanford and Yale did studies on this, as well as Forbes magazine. These are widely held practices and beliefs that take leadership to action and allow tangible, operationalized change to occur. So where we start with is conduct a stakeholder analysis. You can't do with information without the information to make a data-driven decision. So doing a stakeholder analysis will let you know the good, the bad, and the ugly, let you know precisely where you are at this time, knowing that that knowledge will fuel the change that's to come. Conduct a policy review across your organization. Instead of diversity, equity, and inclusion being a pillar in terms of your strategic planning, make it the body and the foundation that embeds all aspects of your organization or business. Set annual diversity goals. We know when we set goals and there's accountability to them, they happen. Look at your HR data, hiring practices over years and see what trends emerge, and also those exit interviews. Hire diverse HR staff. Now, this is a tricky one. While we want HR staff to always be representative of the population served in the workforce, we also don't want all things HR to fall on people of color, especially in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we see is this is a joint accountability and shouldn't fall on one individual. So what next? What we know, so much of this, it comes down to this, so basic. And the heart of my organization and my business, Connection Coach KC, we build relationships. But the key to those relationships are authentic and sincere. Someone can sniff out if a person is coming with just an opportunity that they are wanting to think about themselves. What we want to do in terms of relationships and thinking about how some white people, 75%, still don't have a friend outside of their own culture, a non-white friend. Think about showing up and learning another person's story. Connect with communities of color by going to that community. We have a tendency to build it and they will come. If we have this wonderful opportunity, this wonderful job, people will come to us. We need to seek out those individuals and go and meet them where they are. Show up to listen, learn, and support. It's not about your needs. If you go in with the ask, nothing seems more inauthentic than when you put that before building the relationship that's so key to the heart of building a pipeline. And engage with those professional organizations. We know that there's professional organizations that are built in affinity groups around specific cultures, groups, or identities. Go where they are and learn who those leaders are and learn more about their mission and how you can support them instead of how they can be a part of what you're doing. Now, what's counterintuitive for all the work that I typically do is thinking about this work is that it's a top-down approach. And those of you who know me and have met me, I'm very much an advocate for those direct service and those grassroots professionals. But in this instance, I have noticed top-down, model the way, and the research shows it, determines so much of the success. And the leaders, this is what you can do. Demonstrate a willingness to have difficult conversations. It's just that easy. And commit to an ongoing learning and admit mistakes. So committing to difficult conversations, well, I said it's just that easy. It's not easy at all because in that lies risk. What I found is most senior leaders hesitate to have these conversations because more than anything, we don't want to look incompetent in a work setting. The idea that we may look incompetent makes us look vulnerable, which looks like we may not be effective leaders. What I dare say, the most effective leaders are the ones who acknowledge their gaps, make a plan to step into them, and surround themselves with other leaders who can help support their ongoing learning and vice versa. Establish ERGs and affinity groups. I heard Tarina talk about this at Commerce Bank, and I know many other entities have this, to support the professional development of your team with diverse identities. Having those convening spaces, and the term safe space has been used in multiple instances, but it provides just that. Not only is it a space where people can convene to talk about life issues and concerns, but can garner support and allyship in ways that help people retain in their role and gain access to promotions and opportunities. For leaders, it's important to engage in conversations and collaboration across all leadership levels. What we tend to do is we stay with like-level individuals. And I know in big businesses and corporations, this is challenging to do, but I saw this modeled really well. When I worked at Kauffman Scholars, I saw former executive director, Dr. Stephen Green. He matches up with mentors and peers within our groups. And he even took a peer mentor and did a collaboration with her. So this entry-level individual or mid-level was able to have direct contact and collaboration time with him on a bi-weekly, maybe monthly basis. The difference in the relationship that was built, the opportunities for the other individual to be heard, and how he was able to see what was happening with those mid-level individuals was game changer. I can still see the conversations and the remarks as a result of it. More of model the way. So this top-down approach goes further. Many of you may be familiar with the Harvard Implicit Bias test. And what this test does, it's a free test. It exposes just that, your biases. And what we know is there's no immunization for bias and discrimination. We all have biases of which we need to evaluate, observe, and be aware of. When we are aware, that's when we can adjust and pivot and be more mindful. So encourage not only for yourself to take it, but that your senior leaders do the same, and that they look and examine instead of saying, oh, I don't want to know what I've done or where my biases may be, exposing those in a way that allows us to learn, grow, and lead in new spaces. One of the most important things is normalizing conversations about race and equity. As I mentioned, religion, politics, race are the things that we've either been verbally told not to speak about, or we've gotten those subconscious messages that those are things we just don't discuss. It's a new day that what we discuss, we can gain greater understanding for that listen, learn, and lead. So measure progress. You're going to pivot and plan. So what we set goals to and what we measure, and then what we put financial resources to, the next one, is what we will achieve and what we will accomplish. Now, it's not perfect in the line. The road is not a straight arrow like the image portrays here. It's a winding one, and we may pivot and back, but it's that checking in and the constant commitment to say that we're going to keep moving forward and progressing even when we don't get it exactly right. We're going to stop, reevaluate, and show that our commitment to this means that it's just that important to us to get this right. And diversity officers have popped up all over our community. Many organizations had them for some time, as like we've seen with Greg. And but those positions are most effective when they are part of the senior leadership team. I've seen organizations and businesses that have diversity officers, but they do not have the leadership power or voice at the table to really affect change. When the diversity officer is held to the same standard and leadership level as other senior leadership, that is when diversity is truly given the actionable items that it deserves. And so with that, the listen, learn, and lead approach is where we are in this conversation. And as we've seen with the listening sessions, we listen to the experiences of individuals in the personal narrative. Those lived experiences have value. Now learning a bit, I know you've heard from, if you went to part one, a wonderful session talking about individuals with disabilities and what their journey has been. Today, I hope you learned something about the Black experience and what can lead to recruitment, retention, and coming through a very challenging and painful history that will inform where we are going in the future. And then lastly, to lead, if you're from top down, if you're a CEO and hearing this message, or the message of lead from any seat, meaning whether you are in an entry-level position, middle, all the way up to CEO, that you will call out bias and racism and discrimination in any place that it lives, and that you will embody the attributes of an anti-racist to acknowledge that there is growth to be done in our spaces, but that you can be an ally and you can speak and use your privilege and power to make things different for the centuries to come. And with that, I am Nicole Jacobs-Silvey, and we are going to open it up for questions so that we can dig deeper into the content. I know there were a lot of things with the video as well as some of the slides, and so I will open it up to questions at this time. Oh, I had a request to mention the bias test again. So it is the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, and we can send you a link out as well. And what's wonderful about it is a free test, and it's something that any level of employee can take and engage in. I encourage someone to take it, sit, reflect, and process. And then if you have a diversity officer or HR specialist within your organization that you can talk through your results, that is ideal, but they're pretty self-explanatory, even if you didn't get any additional support or explanation, that you can use those results to inform your decisions and reflect on not only your decisions, but your day-to-day practices and how you live those out. A great question came in. Thank you so much. How do we encourage leadership to buy into a DEI plan? One of my mentors and dear friends, David Oliver, he often says we should enter into DEI work because it's the right thing to do. And that's, of course, what I believe as well. But we know that there's some differences in that point of view. What may be of value for one person may not be for another. And what I have found is showing the return on investment for DEI work across the board. And what we've seen time and time again in research, there's so much that shows this. Diverse meaning organizations that have women, individuals with disabilities, different sexual orientation, those from different religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. The more diversity a team has, the more innovative, the more likely they are to achieve their goals. And that thought diversity brings on greater success in so many ways, specifically innovation. So usually going down to the bottom line, the finances, and seeing what it can yield in the end will get those who are hesitant and don't have it from a heart perspective. They may have it from a financial perspective. I hope that's helpful. How are organizations finding leadership opportunities that help build visibility and exposure for existing employees outside of the career ladder? Visibility and exposure, I'm so glad whoever asked this question. It is key, and honestly is the reason that I'm here before you today. I have had people who specifically put my name forward in key opportunities of visibility that let my talents and skills be front and center. So often, if you are not having the visibility and access, you can be steadily doing your work and doing an excellent job, but if no one is aware of it, you can miss out on key opportunities. Some of the things that I see that have been most beneficial in terms of getting greater visibility is looking at leadership programs. And there's a beautiful one, Centurions, with the Chamber, as well as opportunities within different boards and not-for-profit organizations, as you can serve on boards and get leadership discovery and development there. Seeking out a mentor who will be able to support and guide and make those individual connections and personal interactions, that's key as well. That relationship building is at the key of so much of this, especially I feel like networking in Kansas City is the #1 way to engage with senior leaders and learn about other successful leaders in our city. So I'm looking at questions here. Do you have suggestions on how or where we can go to develop entry and exit interview questions? Excellent, excellent question. The Society for Human Resource Management has a list of entry and exit interview questions, and they are usually more broad for any sector, and you may want to personalize them for the sector that you're in. But what I think are so key is asking some open-ended questions within the exit that speaks to culture, right? We said culture eats strategy for lunch, but culture eats talent for breakfast. Seeing what aspects of the culture, you will get some nuggets there in responses that will really inform you in terms of who feels safe. Often, if there's issues within the workplace, HR finds out when someone's leaving and walking out the door. If people don't feel safe enough to go to HR, didn't feel like they could trust their supervisor, some of those things come out in the exit interview, and often people have, by the time they've decided to pack their bags, they're taking their thoughts and their beliefs with them. So taking the ability to check in intentionally in one-on-ones is also a great strategy for finding out what is next in terms of people's thoughts about the space and getting that crucial feedback. What are your suggestions in creating and maintaining a supportive culture that will retain BIPOC? How can we take the pressure off of people of color in cultivating that and land and putting in the hands of leadership? Okay, so thinking about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's so wonderful to have people of color leading in those spaces, especially when they have walked in the shoes. However, when everything falls on the shoulders of the people of color, it becomes the burden of the oppressed to overcome the oppression. And that is not effective, successful, and honestly, the individuals don't have the privilege and power to do that as effectively in the space. So what I would recommend in terms of creating and supporting culture is those affinity groups. Those ERG groups have been so powerful in cultivating this space where the individuals that are BIPOC are celebrated for their contributions, valued for their experiences, and given key opportunities for visibility, as well as cultivating their talent and really creating that pipeline and being groomed for that next role. I think that is really key. So creating space for BIPOC individuals and actually asking them what they need in the space. Sometimes we think we know what individuals need and we need to ask them. How should employers go about helping their Black team members feel like they don't have to code switch? Wow, that's huge. And thank you for calling it code switching. When I talked about being one's authentic self versus assimilation, that is the term. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's using this language, and often people of color do it seamlessly, shifting in the ways we speak and act in one environment, which is home, around friends, versus how we do that in the workplace. And so how we help Black members not feel the need to code switch is showing them that their authentic self is more than good enough. That their authentic self is how you want them to show up. And you do that by recognizing in the instances that they do, or saying, I really enjoyed, or I really appreciate it, and thank you for bringing that perspective, but saying that not only in a one-on-one setting, but in the front of the room. So everyone in your organization and business hears that, so they see it's that walking the talk and modeling the way. We're Black people, people of color, in a constant state of risk analysis. If I do this, will I lose my job? If I say this, will someone slap me on the wrist? Will I miss an opportunity? Will I? It's a constant questioning that goes on. And when an individual knows that despite if they say something that may not be, might not be as, what do I want to say, just affirming of the leadership. Maybe there's some pushback, or maybe it's just stating things the way they want to in their own voice and tone, instead of being tone police, that they are not going to have the ramifications or have the consequences that could lead to dismissal from their role. I think that's how you do that. What groups do you suggest we want to engage more diversity within our work and social circles? I think what I'm hearing from that question, I think you sit down and you see who's in your circle, but then you look to see who's not there. And that's going to be a different answer for each individual. What I would recommend doing is, and not in a checkbox kind of way, making this list of individuals that you have yet to meet, but thinking about who you can learn from, who you need to learn from, to listen and learn, and to build a relationship with, just to hear their story and start there. Well, the groups that I think that are most marginalized and that are least represented, honestly, I rarely see Indigenous individuals spoken about and with intentionality. I also, in terms of religion, Muslim individuals, or those who may be Buddhist, we are very Christian-centered in Kansas City, well, in our nation. Those are the groups that I think we should most seek out and have opportunities to hear and explore. And the AAPI, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, there are so many misnomers about that community that would be a wonderful group to engage with as well. And again, I wanted to apologize that my presentation was primarily focused on the Black experience. It was because there wasn't enough time to dig into each group's identities in the same way, but some of the same tips and tools apply across the board. But I started with the systemic oppression that we know is historic within our country for Black individuals. What can you do if you work in an industry that doesn't have diverse populations going into it? Oh, this is so, I think what the person's getting at is the heart of this is recruitment. And so there is a real pipeline issue. So what happens is people are recruiting from those who have the credentials for a given role. So think of engineering or other STEM roles. But what we had found was that there wasn't a large enough population of candidates going into those education programs within universities to yield the graduates that would be ready and have the degrees and the credentials to be placed in a position or to interview. So there's a pipeline. The funnel is not effective when there aren't enough candidates in the pipeline. And where that starts is in elementary school, and letting what you believe you can achieve, that letting those diverse communities know that those opportunities are there and they can see themselves. So it's self-perpetuating. Students often don't want to become what they don't see themselves in or they're unfamiliar with. However, the reason that there aren't more in that field is because there's not the pipeline. So it's kind of chicken and the egg. So exposing children, all children, to the opportunities, the plentiful opportunities that they have to be whomever they want to be, is the way to do that. Then getting mentors of color in those fields and industries to speak to children and young adults so that they can see those who look like them in those roles.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry about that. It looks like we were cut off a little bit, but we want to thank Nicole so much for this fantastic presentation. She always leaves us with such great ideas to continue our diversity and inclusion work. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to all of our sponsors. These events would definitely not be possible without your generosity and commitment to D&I. Before we conclude, we want to leave you with two things. One is that our Power Diversity Breakfast is on July 28th this year, and we are currently seeking nominations for individuals who take action in their work and at the workplace, is exactly what Nicole was talking about. Those individuals who advocate for diversity and inclusion. So in your workplace, think about someone who does that work, whether that's their job as a diversity and inclusion person, or someone who just takes it upon them to advocate for diversity and inclusion. We will provide a link in the chat section to the link to nominate someone. Very simple to nominate, just your name and email address and organization, and then of course the person who you nominate's information as well. Secondly, the next part of the workshop series is on June 22nd, where we would specifically focus on implicit bias, just to add a little bit to some of the work that and some of the comments and remarks that Nicole made. So again, apologize for the disconnection. I think we're working to get Nicole back, but and we have several more questions and a little bit more time. So if we get her back, we'll definitely bring her back to speak, to finish off the event. All right, here's Nicole back before we log off. Thank you.
Okay, what groups do you suggest we want to engage more diversity within our work and social circles? When I'm thinking about groups to engage with, I would start with some of the not-for-profit organizations that are culturally based, or the organizations that work with specific audiences. So when I think about the Latinx Ed Collaborative, I think about the events that they host, the ones that are open to the community, or the Latino Arts Foundation. What great opportunities to attend events, to learn about their culture, learn about the environment, the mission of the organization, but also meeting individuals that may represent those communities. And those are just two examples. Do you have any tips for reaching more diverse audiences with new job opportunities? What we often do is, so going back to that question, the who do we know? Because we often send things out within our network, there's a ripple effect, but if your network is small, or if you have this individuals who look like you, you're not going to yield the results that you want. What I would recommend is casting the net wide and look within communities to find out who those champions are. There's always champions, and I call them the keys, that open up doors to other opportunities and introduce you to other individuals. What I caution you about, and I get this often, is people will come to me and ask me questions about who do I know, but they don't then take the opportunity to create their own relationships. They piggyback off my relationships, and then there's not that sincerity and authenticity that we spoke about. That's what's so key. So making sure, I even create a networking map with some of my coaching clients, that we look at the spaces they wish to build networks and relationships in, and then we identify key individuals to get to know. And it starts there. Oh, this is good. What are concrete steps leaders can take to truly move the needle in welcoming and belonging? Welcoming and belonging, I can tell as soon as I walk in a space, and I know that you all can too, whether you feel welcomed. It is whether the space dictates a rigid set of ideals about how you should look, act, and conduct yourself. Those are spaces where people feel more inclined to have to put on the mask that we talk about and portray themselves as something other than who they are. Welcoming and authentic spaces celebrate the individual contributions and the collective inclusion of the individuals that are part of it. So that's the individual is celebrated, and also the collective collaboration and unity as well. And it isn't something that's just spoken about during Black History Month or during the holidays or grateful during Thanksgiving, forgiving, that it becomes a part of the everyday in words, actions, and policies. What people also do is ask those to help cultivate the environment. So sometimes there's a culture team with an organization that can help persist and have actual accountability over how can we make this environment welcoming. And the best thing a leader can do is check in. You can get kind of a sense of who looks like they're ostracized or who looks isolated. And if there's cliques that emerge, mean girls in school can grow up to be mean girls in spaces, or bullies or mean boys in school can grow up to be mean boys. It isn't in mean men in workspaces. That bullying can persist in environments very similar to what we saw in our childhood. It's just gone from the playground to the boardroom. So look for those opportunities to identify that and nip it in the bud and acknowledge and address it. It's one of those things that ignoring doesn't help it to go away. Let's see. Sorry, I'm scrolling through questions to make sure I didn't miss any. I saw someone here, Hazel said, for years she endured the racial profiling for fear that she would have retaliation within her workplace. And you know what, that is real talk, being able to be vulnerable within a space. And I'm going to read the rest of her. She said for years she endured the racial profiling for fear to not lose her job until she found trusted leadership who listened and made her feel that she was not different at all. Standing up for being brown is freedom in itself. How can we help others identify their leadership with whom they trust so they won't follow my experience of years living in fear? Hazel, first, thank you so much for that. That is so powerful. Living in fear, I'm going to ask you to give yourself some grace. You were living in fear because you got the message. You either saw someone get in trouble for being who they are and showing up in spaces, or you had a negative experience when you did that yourself. And it wasn't until you were accepted for who you are and the identities that you embody that things changed. And leadership makes all the difference. Leadership makes all the difference. And so you found a leader who would listen, but not all leaders embody what your leader has done. So the point of conversations like this is to get more leaders to identify and look at their own practices. It starts with that self-identification and reflection, and then changing that to action. So when you are able to give feedback, I think is the best. When you're able to share with your leader what has been successful, what has helped you. I really appreciated when you, thank you for, and identifying some areas when you can. Now, I say this, and depending on risk analysis, as we spoke about, it might not be safe to say that to a leader. Identify the allies within your workspace. Sometimes there's allies in your workspace that are not in the leadership role, but can come alongside you and help support you in your spaces that you embody. So that's what I would recommend, Hazel. Your living in fear is something that you're not alone in. And it comes from experience often of having negative consequences for showing up as yourself. And it wasn't until you were accepted that you're able to go a new path. So thank you for that. There's a question about how important is psychological safety when incorporating diversity and inclusion in leadership. And I saw this question several times, and thank you so much. I think it's maybe Demetrius asked it. Psychological safety is a topic that I'm learning more and more about, and it's just as it sounds. Psychological safety, having the safety and the comfort and the protection to be oneself emotionally vulnerable. And Brene Brown speaks about this so much in her How to Lead with Vulnerability. Psychological safety, I think, is at the core. It's what allows us to take off our masks. It's what allows us to be our authentic self, but it also shows us that you can be vulnerable and still be successful. There had so long been a thought that first vulnerability was tied to being a woman or a female presenting person. And instead of seeing as a leadership attribute and quality that can move you forward in the space that you're in and help provide an environment that allows people to see that you have flaws, and in your flaws, you can still be successful. So psychological safety is key. The more that leaders can embody psychological safety, learn about it, it is what can help reduce some anxiety that we often feel within a workspace and help build bonds and creativity and innovation. Because when we remove all of the masks and we remove all of the things, the backpack that we carry of these invisible issues and nuances and things that are very real, but they can't be seen, invisible, then we're able to be our full selves and be successful in spaces the way we're meant to be. No, Sydney, if that's the last question. Okay, can you point to companies or organizations that are succeeding in creating a pipeline, diversifying staff, and creating welcoming spaces? Thank you, whoever asked this, because I missed this in my slide and wanted to specifically speak to it. Yes, so what I saw with the Kansas City Girls Preparatory Academy, I remember when Tom Krebs, the leader, a white gentleman, came to me and he wanted to sit down, just have a conversation. He was talking to me about doing recruitment for the school. He didn't say, who do you know? He wasn't just picking my brain or asking for names. He wanted to intentionally find out where talented individuals, and he already had his research done, but additional talented individuals could come that could join his team that were equity minded, and the girls could see reflections of themselves. So what he shared with me, and also Christine Kemper, one of the founding members, they set, before they even found their founding principle, they set out to have a certain percentage of candidates be individuals of color. They set that with no unequivocal terms. They said, this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to start our interviews and start the process until we reach this number. And they wanted a number that was reflective of the community. I remember people saying they're never going to get it. That's never going to happen, not in Kansas City. Listen, there were so many naysayers, but they stood committed to that goal and they made that happen. So that's an organization that I see locally. When I speak nationally, Facebook's gotten lots and lots of criticism, but you may have seen they recently released that they will have 30% of their leadership team be represented by people of color within the next 5 years. And when you think about an influential organization in business like Facebook, that is monumental. And then they set some performance measures that go along with it. So they have done that, and specifically saying that it is so important that we are making a part of our fundamental structure, because what we measure and what we hold accountable is what will make happen. So I thank you so much for all of your questions. I appreciate your time today. And I did want to make one final mention that I was remiss in saying earlier. In these spaces, we want to be as inclusive as possible. And I know Greg and the team are committed to that. We had intended to have this as a closed caption event today, but we're unable to make that happen. And so please bear with us. That is something that the Chamber is working on. And we want to be inclusive of all of the audience that's come to our sessions and share space with us. So thank you for that. I appreciate the time today and welcome the opportunity from all of the sponsors. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. If we were live and in person, you would receive a thunderous applause As always, you do a fantastic job. And so we really value and appreciate the partnership you have with the Chamber. And now you're a member of the Chamber, so thank you very much. With that, we just want to remind you that our next event is on June 22nd with the topic of implicit bias. On behalf of the Chamber and all of our partners and our sponsors, thank you so much and have a fantastic day.